Harlem, New York. 11:23 a.m. Thursday, June 18, 1959. The heat sat heavy on the asphalt like a threat that hadn't made up its mind yet. 87 degrees and climbing, turning the sidewalks of 145th Street into a slow cooking griddle that made the air shimmer with violence and possibility. Outside the Red Rooster Social Club, the kind of establishment where jazz leaked through brick walls and money changed hands in whispers, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stood in perfect stillness. His charcoal gray suit was custom-tailored, pressed sharp enough to cut glass. His burgundy silk tie caught the light like dried blood. His Italian leather shoes reflected the world in their mirror shine, a world he controlled from 110th Street to 155th, 12 square blocks of Manhattan where his word carried more weight than the law. At his feet lay the carcass of his German shepherd, Duke. 3 years old. Loyal. Dead. Someone had opened the animal's throat with surgical precision, ear to ear, letting the blood pool black on the concrete where it mixed with motor oil and yesterday's rain. The body had been dumped there deliberately. In broad daylight. On Bumpy's street. Outside his club. The message was carved in flesh and spelled out in blood. Across the street, through the window of Carmine's barbershop, 3 men in expensive suits watched with the casual interest of spectators at a boxing match they'd already fixed. Gold watches. Diamond cufflinks. Genovese's family soldiers operating under direct orders from Vincent the Chin Gigante. For months they'd been pushing into Harlem, trying to muscle in on the numbers racket that Bumpy had built with his own hands and other men's fear. They'd made offers. He'd refused. They'd made threats. He'd ignored them. So they'd escalated to the language they thought he'd understand: brutality without honor, cruelty without purpose. One of the men in the barbershop was smoking a Cuban cigar. He was smiling. Bumpy stood over Duke's body for exactly 7 minutes and 14 seconds. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't look up. The street went silent around him like the moment before thunder breaks. People who'd been walking stopped mid-stride. Shopkeepers appeared in their doorways. Children playing stickball froze with their bats raised. Everyone knew what this meant. Everyone knew what came next. In Harlem, when you touched what belonged to Bumpy Johnson, you paid a price that compounded daily until the debt was settled in full. When Bumpy finally raised his head, his eyes found the barbershop window with the precision of a rifle scope. The man with the cigar stopped smiling. Bumpy's face showed nothing, no anger, no grief, just the cold mathematics of war being calculated behind eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a white silk handkerchief monogrammed with his initials. He wiped his hands slowly, methodically, even though they weren't dirty. Then he folded the handkerchief with the care of a man preparing for surgery, placed it back in his pocket, and walked into the Red Rooster without looking back. 72 hours later, 14 men would be dead. The Genovese family would lose $340,000 in a single weekend. 3 of their gambling houses would burn to foundations. Vincent Gigante would find a handwritten note pinned to his front door. You sent one message. I'm sending 14. We're done talking. The man with the cigar would be pulled from the Hudson River, weighted down with chains, his mouth stuffed with dog biscuits and a playing card that read, "House always wins." The story of how the Genovese family learned to never touch Bumpy Johnson's world again is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now, let's go back to June 15th, 1959, 3 days before the dog died. January 1959 brought more than winter cold to Harlem. It brought Vincent the Chin Gigante's calculated ambition, wrapped in expensive overcoats and delivered through soldiers who understood that respect was a commodity to be extracted, not earned. The Genovese family had been studying Bumpy Johnson's numbers operation for 18 months. analyzing a business that generated $200,000 weekly in gambling revenue. This wasn't random expansion. This was systematic siege, designed to dismantle an empire brick by brick. Their methodology was clinical in its precision. First came the money. Genovese representatives approached independent bookies with briefcases full of cash, offering buyouts that seemed generous until you understood the alternative. They doubled cuts for operators willing to switch sides, promising better muscle and protection from both cops and rivals. When financial incentives failed, the second phase began. Knuckles met ribs. Faces met brick walls. The message was simple: work for the Genovese family, or don't work at all. By February, they were buying off operators who were tired, scared, or greedy. One numbers man on 132nd Street, who'd been skimming from Bumpy for years, saw opportunity in the chaos. The Italians doubled his cut and promised real protection. Within 2 weeks, he was handing over client names, collection routes, and operational schedules like he was reading from a script. The Genovese soldiers documented everything. They weren't improvising a war. They were building a blueprint for conquest. Then came the humiliation campaign. 3 incidents made their intentions brutally clear. February 15th, Samuel Green ran numbers from his barbershop on 132nd Street. 2 Genovese soldiers informed him the ownership structure had changed. When Samuel mentioned Bumpy Johnson's protection, they forced him to kneel on his own floor for 45 minutes, making him repeat, "I work for the Genovese family now," until his voice broke. Regular customers watched their neighborhood businessman stripped of dignity in broad daylight. March 8th, Dorothy Washington owned a social club where runners collected neighborhood bets. She was 61, a widow who'd built her business from nothing. The Italians made her kneel on the sidewalk outside her establishment in freezing rain, forcing her to apologize for disrespecting them while morning commuters walked past. 20 minutes of public humiliation for refusing to surrender what she'd built with her own hands. March 22nd, James Quick Patterson ran East Harlem's most profitable corner operation. 4 Genovese soldiers didn't ask for cooperation. They demanded it. When Quick mentioned Bumpy's name, they laughed. Then, they made him kneel in front of his runners, his customers, his wife who worked the counter. They made him kiss their shoes. All 4 pairs. One by one, while his wife cried and his employees looked away because watching was worse than the humiliation itself. Bumpy heard about each incident within hours. His response confused the Italians who expected immediate violence. Instead, he requested meetings. Quiet conversations in neutral locations. He sent messages through intermediaries suggesting cooperation benefited everyone, that certain boundaries should be respected. The Genovese interpreted his measured approach as weakness, telling each other that the legendary Bumpy Johnson had gone soft, that his reputation was nostalgia. March 30th, the final meeting happened at Gino's restaurant in Little Italy. Bumpy sat across from Tommy the Hammer Costello, a Genovese lieutenant with dead eyes and hands that had broken more bones than car accidents. Tommy delivered the ultimatum with casual cruelty: step aside or get stepped on, boy. Your choice, but choose fast. The racial slur hung between them like gunpowder waiting for a spark. Bumpy stared at Tommy for exactly 37 seconds of suffocating silence. Then he stood, placed exact change for his untouched coffee on the table, and walked out without saying one word. That evening, Bumpy told his inner circle, "They think silence means surrender. Let them think that for exactly 72 more hours." By mid-June, the Genovese family had abandoned all pretense of negotiation. June 15th marked their transition from pressure tactics to open occupation. Vincent Gigante's soldiers walked Bumpy Johnson's territory with the casual entitlement of conquerors, intercepting numbers runners in broad daylight and demanding tribute with systematic cruelty. They didn't just want money. They wanted submission. Every collection became a public demonstration that the old order was dead, that humiliation was the new currency of control. Marcus Webb was 19 years old, running numbers for 3 years, saving every spare dollar for City College because his mother believed education offered the only escape from streets that devoured young men. That Tuesday afternoon, he collected $340 walking his usual route from 142nd to 148th Street. 3 Genovese soldiers cornered him outside his mother's apartment building, demanding his collection with racial slurs that made neighbors turn their heads. Marcus refused, not from bravery, but because surrendering felt like betraying everything Bumpy had built, everything his mother had sacrificed for. They beat him with claw hammers, methodical, precise, breaking both hands so he'd never collect another dollar, shattering his left kneecap so he'd carry their message in his limp for life. His mother screamed from her third-floor window, but nobody intervened because intervention meant becoming the next lesson. They left him bleeding on the sidewalk with their ultimatum, "Tell the NR King we're not asking anymore." Then they took the $340 and walked away like they'd completed ordinary business. Bumpy arrived at Harlem Hospital that evening. The air smelled of antiseptic and dried blood. Marcus was barely recognizable, a swollen map of purple bruising wrapped in white bandages, his hands gauze-covered stumps already bleeding through. Bumpy pulled a chair beside the bed, sat in complete silence for 2 minutes, studying the systematic destruction of a 19-year-old's future. Then he asked one question, his voice barely a whisper in the quiet ward. What exactly did they say? Through a jaw wired shut, Marcus strained to repeat the message word for word. Bumpy nodded once, placed a thick envelope of cash on the bedside table for medical bills, and walked out without another word. The slur wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration of war against his very existence. June 17th brought escalation designed for maximum desecration. A Genovese crew arrived at the Red Rooster Social Club at 4 a.m. when witnesses were scarce. They spray-painted racial slurs across the brick facade in letters 3 feet tall. They drew crude nooses on the front door. They shattered every window facing the street, then urinated on the entrance because true violation required fluids, not just paint. By sunrise, Bumpy's headquarters looked like a crime scene announcing that sacred spaces no longer existed. His associates gathered inside by 7 that morning, demanding immediate retaliation. Blood for blood, bodies for disrespect. The mathematics seemed simple. The Italians had declared war, so war should be delivered with overwhelming force. But Bumpy said no. 2 letters that confused men who'd followed him through decades of street conflicts. Not yet. Let them think they're winning. His voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of someone calculating interest rates on debts that would be collected with precision timing. June 18th started with absence. Duke, the German shepherd that Stephanie St. Clair had given Bumpy as a symbol of loyalty and protection, was missing from his apartment building. The dog never wandered, never left Bumpy's side unless commanded. At 11:15 that morning, the phone rang. Unknown voice. Male. Calm. Check outside your club. Then, silence. Bumpy walked outside to find Duke's body displayed on the sidewalk, throat opened ear to ear, and understood that business had transformed into something else entirely. This wasn't about territory anymore. This was personal, and personal debts were always paid with interest. The temperature around Bumpy Johnson had dropped to absolute 0 while he stood over Duke's body for exactly 7 minutes and 14 seconds. Across the street, through the window of Carmine's barbershop, Anthony Smokes Benedetto drew on his Cuban cigar with the casual satisfaction of a man who believed he'd just witnessed capitulation. The other 2 Genovese soldiers flanked him, their smiles small and knowing, convinced that the silence stretching over 145th Street meant they had finally broken Harlem's protector. They had positioned Duke's body deliberately, not dropped, but arranged like stage props in their theater of intimidation. Bumpy's eyes swept from his dog's torn throat to that barbershop window, marking faces with the precision of a man cataloging inventory. There was no visible reaction, no twitch of muscle or flare of nostril. Just a long, flat stare that transformed the distance between them into a death sentence they were too ignorant to recognize. When he finally turned away and walked into the Red Rooster, his footsteps echoed on concrete that still held his dog's warmth. Inside, the air was dense with tension and stale cigarette smoke. His 5 most trusted lieutenants were already waiting, faces tight with barely controlled rage, bodies coiled for immediate retaliation. These weren't street thugs, but the architects of Bumpy's empire, men who understood that violence was a tool requiring surgical precision. Bumpy moved to the heavy oak table in the center and spread out a detailed map of Manhattan, a hand-drawn masterpiece documenting every Genovese operation from 110th Street to the Bronx border. 18 months of intelligence gathering condensed into a single tactical document. Using red ink, he began marking targets with methodical precision. First came circles around gambling houses on 125th Street, then triangles marking safe houses where Italian soldiers slept believing their reputation was armor. Crosses appeared over collection points in East Harlem. Lines connected operational routes. When finished, the map looked less like city streets and more like a circulatory system about to experience systematic clotting. Bumpy's voice cut through the room's tension, cold and surgical, devoid of the rage lesser men would have displayed. They want to send messages. We're going to send a curriculum in applied consequences. This wouldn't be emotional retaliation. This would be calculated dismantling, each action designed to teach lessons that would echo through organized crime for decades. He divided his forces into 3 coordinated units with military precision that would have impressed actual generals. Team Alpha received financial disruption assignments. Their mission was destroying the Genovese economic foundation in Harlem, hitting gambling houses with overwhelming force, confiscating every dollar, burning ledgers that documented operations. The Italians understood profit. Eliminating their revenue stream would hurt worse than bullets. Team Bravo got personnel elimination mandates. 14 soldiers targeted systematically over 3 nights, each death designed to send specific messages about consequences and mathematics. Not random violence, but numbered executions creating a countdown of terror. Playing cards would mark each body, transforming murder into curriculum. Team Charlie handled psychological warfare, ensuring the Italians understood this wasn't chaos, but calculated retribution. Every action needed context. Every death required explanation. Fear was most effective when victims understood the system destroying them. Bumpy's finger moved to Carmine's barbershop location on the map. "Benedetto is mine," he stated, assigning the cigar-smoking soldier to himself personally. The man with the smile. "No one touches him until I say so." One associate, younger and less experienced in street justice mathematics, voiced the question hanging in the room like smoke. What if the Genovese bosses retaliate? Bumpy's response came without hesitation, his voice carrying cold certainty of someone who'd already calculated every variable. They won't have anyone left to retaliate with. As his men filed out to gather weapons and synchronize watches, Bumpy remained alone at the table. He pulled out a leather-bound notebook, the kind businessmen used for important transactions, and began writing 14 names in careful handwriting. Each name represented a soldier, a life, a lesson in applied consequences. When the list was complete, he took his red pen and drew a single, decisive line through the first name. The war had not yet started on the streets, but on that page, it had already claimed its opening casualty. The first phase of Bumpy Johnson's curriculum in applied consequences began at exactly 10:30 p.m. On June 18th, transforming Harlem streets from commerce to combat zone, Team Alpha approached the Genovese gambling house on 125th Street with military precision that suggested months of reconnaissance, not hours of planning. The target operated behind the facade of a wholesale bakery, where 6 Italian soldiers sat around green, felt counting the night's collection in neat stacks, totaling $47,000. They were secure in the illusion that their reputation rendered them untouchable, laughing about crude jokes when Bumpy's crew entered through the reinforced back door with movements so silent the first soldier didn't notice until a gun barrel pressed against his temple. No shots were fired. The silence was more terrifying than gunfire would have been. Team Alpha moved through the Italians like auditors through a crooked ledger, forcing 6 men to their knees while they swept cash into canvas bags with rehearsed efficiency. The entire confiscation took 4 minutes and 18 seconds. But taking the money wasn't enough. The ledgers documenting weeks of illegal operations, names, debts, and territorial agreements were carried outside and burned in the middle of 125th Street, flames consuming records that couldn't be reconstructed from memory alone. When the fire finished its work, they returned inside and placed a single playing card face up on the counting table where $47,000 had been stacked moments before. The ace of spades, hand-written across its face in red ink. 1. At 1:15 a.m. On June 19th, the violence escalated from economic disruption to physical elimination. 2 Genovese collectors named Paulie Greco and Dominic Russo exited a speakeasy on 138th Street, pockets heavy with protection money, minds clouded with whiskey confidence. They never saw the black sedan pull alongside them or heard the doors open with predatory silence. Hands grabbed them, pulled them inside, and the vehicle disappeared into Harlem's dark arteries before witnesses could process what they'd witnessed. The drive to the East River took 19 minutes of complete silence, just the sound of tires on wet pavement and 2 men realizing their mistakes had finally caught up with them. The executions were professional. Single bullets through the back of each skull, delivered with the same cold efficiency as the gambling house raid. But the message required geographical emphasis. Their bodies were driven downtown and dumped at strategic locations in Little Italy, a direct territorial challenge that couldn't be misunderstood. Playing cards were pinned to their chests with straight pins that pierced fabric and flesh. Paulie's card read 2, Dominic's read 3. The Italians would find their own soldiers on their own streets, understanding that nowhere was safe from Bumpy's reach. At 4:30 a.m., the operation reached command level. Sal the Suit Marchetti, the Genovese lieutenant responsible for coordinating the harassment campaign against Bumpy's operations, was dragged from his mistress's apartment in the Bronx, still wearing silk pajamas that cost more than most men earned monthly. They transported him to an abandoned warehouse near the Harlem River, where Bumpy waited alone under a single hanging bulb, sitting in a metal folding chair like a judge prepared to hear testimony. Bumpy asked one question, his voice conversational, almost gentle. Who gave the order about the dog? Sal, even terrified, understood that answering meant betraying Vincent Gigante, and betrayal carried consequences that might be worse than whatever Bumpy intended. He stayed silent, clinging to Mafia code and rapidly evaporating arrogance. Bumpy nodded like he'd expected nothing else, then picked up a tire iron that had been resting against his chair. The systematic torture that followed was clinical in its precision, focused entirely on extracting information rather than inflicting gratuitous pain. Both kneecaps were shattered with measured strikes, the kind of calculated violence that erased dignity and reduced men to their most primal desperation. Within 6 minutes, Sal's resolve crumbled completely. He screamed Vincent Gigante's name between sobs, confirming what Bumpy already knew but needed stated for the record. The single bullet to the back of Sal's head came as mercy after the information extraction was complete, delivered without emotion or ceremony. Transaction complete. Sal's body appeared at the Genovese Social Club on Mulberry Street just before dawn, positioned sitting upright against the front door like a grotesque doorman. The playing card pinned to his expensive suit jacket read 4. Attached was a handwritten note in precise script, ask Vincent why his dog policy failed. By sunrise, 3 more bodies had materialized at locations designed for maximum psychological impact. Tommy Bags Benedetto was found slumped in his car outside his mother's house in Queens, a playing card marked 5 pinned to his jacket. Marco the Fist DeLuca was discovered in an alley behind his favorite restaurant in Little Italy, his card reading 6. Johnny Scars Torino was left on the steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral, his card displaying 7. Each location was chosen deliberately, each death designed to communicate that Bumpy's mathematics of revenge extended far beyond Harlem into spaces the Italians considered protected territory. Between 6 and 7 a.m. Vincent the Chin Gigante's phone rang 7 separate times. 7 different voices. 7 different locations. 7 playing cards counting upward like a doomsday clock. With each call, his understanding crystallized into horror. This wasn't random violence or chaotic retaliation. This was systematic elimination, executed with military precision and mathematical inevitability. And the numbers were still climbing. By midday on June 19th, the Genovese family's carefully constructed reputation had collapsed into something resembling panic. 7 bodies in 12 hours transformed soldiers who'd terrorized neighborhoods into frightened men who refused to leave safe houses, understanding that every street corner might conceal their numbered execution. Phone lines burned with frantic conversations about systematic elimination that felt less like gang warfare and more like surgical extermination. Each playing card representing not just death, but mathematical inevitability that no amount of Italian pride could calculate away. Vincent the Chin Gigante convened an emergency meeting in his fortified Mulberry Street headquarters, surrounded by lieutenants whose confidence had evaporated with the sunrise body count. His face was a mask of furious desperation as he slammed his fist onto a desk covered in reports of dead men. Immediate counterattack, he commanded, his voice tight with the kind of rage that comes from losing control of a narrative you thought you owned. Hit their primary numbers spot. Show them what real war looks like. It was strategy born of wounded pride rather than tactical wisdom, ignoring the fundamental reality that Bumpy Johnson had already anticipated this exact response with the same precision he'd planned every previous move. At 3 p.m., 4 heavily armed Genovese soldiers approached Bumpy's known collection spot on 147th Street, expecting to find terrified clerks and scrambling runners. Instead, they walked into a carefully prepared trap where Bumpy's men had been waiting for hours with strategic positioning and superior firepower. The gunfight lasted exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds, a brutal exchange that left all 4 Italians dead on the linoleum floor while Bumpy's crew disappeared through pre-planned exit routes like ghosts who'd never existed. When police arrived 20 minutes later, they found 4 bodies and 4 playing cards arranged with deliberate precision on cooling chests. 8, 9, 10, 11. The mathematical progression continued with terrifying inevitability. By 7:45 p.m., the offensive shifted back to economic destruction. The Genovese gambling house on 138th Street, a 3-story operation that generated $30,000 weekly, erupted in flames that could be seen from 6 blocks away. Team Alpha had infiltrated through the basement, doused every floor with accelerant, and ignited the structure with military precision before anyone inside could react. The building burned for 2 hours while fire crews fought flames that seemed determined to consume every brick and board. Inside, $120,000 in cash transformed into ash, along with ledgers documenting operations across 3 boroughs. On the sidewalk outside, spray painted in letters 4 feet tall, was a message designed for Vincent Gigante's personal consumption. This is what disrespect costs interest compounding daily. At 11:20 p.m., the body count resumed its upward climb. 2 more Genovese soldiers were discovered slumped in a parked Cadillac on a quiet Bronx street, both shot execution style through the back of the head with the professional efficiency that had characterized every killing in Bumpy's curriculum. Playing cards were placed on the dashboard where responding officers couldn't miss them, 12 and 13. Only one number remained in the equation, and everyone in organized crime understood exactly what that meant. Anthony Smokes Benedetto, the man who'd smiled while watching Duke bleed on the sidewalk, abandoned his apartment, his routines, his known associates, and checked into a third-rate Bronx hotel under a fabricated name. He told no one his location, wedged a chair under the doorknob, kept his pistol loaded on the nightstand, and tried to convince himself that disappearing into New York's anonymous sprawl might purchase survival. Vincent Gigante sat in his office, understanding he'd miscalculated catastrophically. 13 soldiers dead. Operations destroyed. Territory abandoned. He considered calling a truce, but pride wouldn't allow public surrender to Bumpy Johnson, that particular poison that destroys men who confuse reputation with invincibility. June 20th, 2:00 a.m. Anthony Benedetto was staring at the ceiling when someone knocked on his hotel room door. He checked the peephole, saw an empty hallway, and opened the door slowly. Bumpy Johnson stood there alone, holding a dog leash in his right hand, his face expressing the same cold calculation it had displayed standing over Duke's body 8 hours earlier. The door clicked shut with finality that seemed to echo longer than physics should allow. Anthony Benedetto backed toward the unmade bed, the cheap hotel room's disinfectant smell mixing with the metallic scent of his own panic. Bumpy Johnson stood motionless near the entrance, his charcoal suit immaculate despite 3 days of systematic warfare. The dog leash hung loose in his right hand, its metal clasp tapping softly against itself with each slight movement, creating a rhythm that counted down to inevitability. Anthony's words tumbled out in desperate streams, explanations rehearsed during sleepless hours but now sounding hollow even to his own ears. It was just business, Bumpy, just a message. Nothing personal against you. Orders from upstairs, you know how this works. We were trying to make a point about territory. His voice cracked, stripping away the tough guy facade he'd worn outside the barbershop just days earlier. Bumpy listened without interrupting, his face expressing the detached interest of someone examining symptoms of a terminal diagnosis. When Anthony's explanations exhausted themselves into silence, Bumpy spoke with calm precision, never raising his voice above conversational tone. Everything is personal when you cross certain lines. You just didn't understand whose lines you were crossing. You thought killing my dog was strategy. But that represented something you couldn't comprehend because you only understand violence as transaction, not as violation. The panic escalated as Bumpy calmly explained that Anthony would be number 14, completing the mathematical equation of justice. Money came next in Anthony's bargaining, briefcases full of cash that could materialize within hours. Then, information, promising to expose every Genovese secret he'd accumulated. Finally, exile, swearing on his mother's life that he'd disappear to California or Florida, anywhere beyond Bumpy's supposed reach. Each offer was met with the same detached interest of someone hearing proposals already rejected before they were voiced. You smiled, Bumpy said, his voice dropping even quieter, forcing Anthony to strain to hear words that would be among the last he'd comprehend. I saw you smile when my dog was bleeding on the street. You stood in that window, safe behind glass, and you enjoyed it. That smile cost you everything you'll ever have. The statement wasn't delivered with anger or satisfaction, just flat observation of cause and effect, moral arithmetic operating in a world Anthony thought was governed only by greed and fear. What happened next occurred beyond detailed description, but the outcome was as inevitable and final as mathematics itself. Some equations only balance one way. June 20th, 9 a.m., sanitation workers pulled Anthony Benedetto's body from the Hudson River near the West Side piers. Weighted with industrial chains, his mouth was stuffed with dog biscuits that had turned soft from river water but remained unmistakable in their meaning. Pinned to his soaked jacket was the final playing card, handwritten in red ink, 14 House always wins. Vincent Gigante found a handwritten letter on his doorstep that same morning, delivered by methods he'd never determine. The letter explained in precise detail what had happened and why, walking through the mathematics of disrespect and its compounding interest. The final paragraph was brief and definitive. You wanted Harlem. The price was too high. Send another message, and I'll send 20. Within 48 hours, the Genovese family withdrew all operations from Bumpy Johnson's territory. For the next 5 years, no Italian crew attempted expansion into Harlem, understanding that certain boundaries were enforced not with negotiations, but with numbered playing cards and lessons history wouldn't forget. The official record would classify it as an unsolved cluster of homicides, 14 men dead across 3 days in a city already drowning in violence. The NYPD assigned 40 seasoned detectives to what became a masterclass in institutional futility. They canvassed neighborhoods from Harlem to Little Italy, interviewing hundreds of potential witnesses who'd developed selective amnesia with surgical precision. Evidence collected could fit in a single manila folder: 14 bodies, 14 playing cards, and a mathematical progression that told a story no one would corroborate. Lead detective Raymond Walsh spent 6 weeks chasing leads that evaporated like morning fog, understanding he was investigating a war fought by rules his badge couldn't comprehend. The wall of silence wasn't constructed from intimidation, but from mutual understanding that street justice operated by different mathematics than legal justice. In Harlem, shopkeepers who'd witnessed systematic brutality suddenly couldn't recall faces they'd known for decades. In Little Italy, Genovese associates claimed ignorance with practiced ease, understanding that cooperation with police carried more danger than any criminal prosecution. Both communities recognized that what had transpired wasn't crime but correction, a rebalancing that operated on frequencies the law couldn't intercept. While task forces filed paperwork and captains held press conferences about ongoing investigations, Bumpy Johnson returned to his routine with terrifying normalcy. He visited barbershops for regular trims, checked numbers operations with casual interest of a businessman reviewing quarterly reports, and dined at the Red Rooster where waiters served his usual meal without asking. The blood-stained 72 hours might never have happened, except everyone knew they had, and that knowledge changed everything about how Harlem breathed. Community reaction was complex alchemy of relief and terror coexisting in the same psychological space. Relief because the Genovese threat had been eliminated with surgical precision, because their neighborhoods remained protected by someone who understood their struggles. Terror because they'd witnessed the mathematical brutality Bumpy deployed when civilized rules were violated. Parents whispered the story in coded language, ensuring children understood that protection existed but carried expectations. They watched Bumpy pass with newfound reverence that bordered on religious fear, stepping aside not from servitude but survival instinct. Throughout New York's organized crime landscape, Italian families absorbed the lesson with crystalline clarity. Certain territories were permanently off-limits, not because of negotiated treaties, but because expansion into Harlem meant facing an opponent who treated warfare as applied mathematics rather than emotional reaction. The Genovese catastrophe became cautionary tale whispered in social clubs from Brooklyn to the Bronx. Maps and backrooms were redrawn. Harlem became blank space marked with invisible ink everyone could read, but no one dared speak aloud. One afternoon, Bumpy visited Duke's old resting spot outside the Red Rooster. A new German shepherd sat there, 3 years old, calm and alert, watching the street with protective intelligence. Bumpy knelt, scratched behind the animal's ears with surprising gentleness, staying there for minutes in contemplation that passers-by respected with distance. The dog wore a leather collar with brass fittings that caught sunlight like small warnings. In a world built entirely on violence, some men still enforced civilized rules, creating order through disciplined will. When those rules were broken, the response wasn't emotional outburst, but mathematical precision calculated to teach lessons outliving the participants. The 14 deaths served as permanent reminder that respect in the underworld was never given, but enforced systematically, that some debts could only be settled in blood measured by exact accounting. The war had started with a note pinned to a dead dog. He bleeds like you will. It ended with 14 playing cards recovered from 14 corpses, each numbered in ascending order, each representing a life taken in precise retaliation. Together, they proved the ultimate truth of Bumpy Johnson's Harlem: disrespect isn't emotional impulse requiring immediate reaction. It's an invoice requiring methodical collection, and payment is always extracted in full, with interest compounding daily until the ledger balances with mathematical finality no one would forget.